let's wrap up the discussions on the Residential Property Disclosure Act and introduce measuring houses. So, we left off talking about the Residential Property Disclosure Act in North Carolina. And of course, the Residential Property Disclosure Act as it currently sits includes both the RPODs and the MOG. And of course, those are fun-filled names. And so it is very important to understand a couple of things. I told you that this, if you don't get them, because it's required, if you don't get them, meaning the buyer doesn't get them prior to making an offer, that's when that kind of time period comes into play where they have this additional type of protection. Now, I want to warn you about something, because the way that it sits right now, there's the document section, and most of the time we upload this into the MLS. I don't know if anything's going to change with the document section of the multiple listing service. I don't know if we're going to have to put these in different places. But here's a point of clarity that I think we all need to understand. Just because it's uploaded into the MLS doesn't mean that it satisfied the requirements of the Residential Property Disclosure Act, which is why when somebody submits an offer, we as listing agents want them to check the box on the offer to purchase and contract that says, yes, I have received it prior to making this offer. And then we also ask that they give us the signed copy so there's no confusion. So what I'm telling you, and this we talk about this more in post-licensing in 302, which is contracts and closings. When you send an offer, or if you're a listing agent that gets an offer, it's really dependent on what they put on the offer. Because even if you've uploaded it in the MLS, if they send you an offer and they have not included the signed RPODs and MOG, and they have checked the box that says, no, we haven't received it, and you let your seller accept that, then they automatically have that 3-day period. It doesn't matter that you put them in the MLS. Because what a court of law would go by, what a judge would go by, is what's in the contract. So if you know that you provided the RPODs and the MOG in a timely fashion in the MLS, and you ever get an offer as a listing agent where they say, I haven't received them, you send it back. You say, nope, the RPODs and the MOG are in the MLS. Download them, have your buyer sell them, update the offer to say, yes, you received them, and then send it back over. You never want to give them that 3-day get out of jail free card if you know that you have the disclosures up and ready to go. Now, it is 3 days, as I mentioned earlier, from whichever occurs first. 3 days from, going under contract without receiving them. 3 days from the date you receive them, whichever occurs first. Of course, the last little piece says, well, you've invalidated your protections if you move into the property or if you close on the property. I can't really foresee a time where you'd ever be moving into the property or closing on the property within 3 days. But if you were, for some instance, getting to move in the day you got under contract, toss it out the window. You no longer have these protections anymore. That's what that means. So let's get into some more things in dealing with sellers as we continue these discussions. As I said, we have an obligation to discover and disclose anything and everything, regardless of the seller's the way they fill out the disclosure. And that's where y'all kind of told me, we look around, we look for water damage, we ask questions. Was this repaired? Do you have invoices? Did you pull permits? Can you give me a timeline? It all goes back to that discovering piece of the discover and disclose for material facts. And when in doubt, you got to disclose it. Now, of course, there is this very detailed graphic here, and it's overkill in my opinion, in dealing with some of these disclosures. Of course, we've got to explain whether or not their property is exempt from the property disclosure. If it's not, then we've got to provide it to them. We've got to explain that they need to fill it out. What happens if we don't get it to the buyer before they make an offer? Of course, that we still have to disclose things regardless of how they answer it. Give them advice on how to properly complete it. Make sure that, this is an important note, it is every single broker's responsibility to facilitate getting these documents to the buyer. And so if you're the listing agent, you need to provide it in a timely manner to the buyer's agent. Buyer's agent needs to provide it in a timely manner to their buyer. And I will make an extra note here. Continued accuracy. Well, folks, two things come into play with the continued accuracy piece. Okay? If you're looking at our offer to purchase and contract standard Form 2T in North Carolina, what it basically states is that you have to get the home in the same or better condition as it was on the time that you put the offer in, reasonable wear and tear accepted. And so let's say that the RPOD says that there's no roof leak, and that's true. But maybe a hailstorm comes in and now the roof is leaking. Well, the seller is going to be obligated to fix it because that's not the same property that you went under contract on. But let me explain something else. Let's say let's say it gets under contract. There is a roof leak discovered that the seller didn't know about it. The buyer terminates and it goes back on the market. Well, folks, we all know as real estate professionals, we would have to disclose that roof leak as a material fact. We've got this obligation. But if we put it back on the market and we don't have the seller update the RPODs and it still says, no, there's no roof leak, we are opening our sellers now up to liability because they are committing a misrepresentation. They'd be fine if they said no representation, but because they initially said no, that's the issue. We need to advise our clients when they figure out something. If we go back in the market, it's not just us that has to disclose. We need to make sure they're not committing fraud. That's what it means by continued accuracy. If something changes and the seller's not obligated to fix it and they're now committing fraud, they need to change it to either yes or no representation. Of course, we get the buyer's signatures acknowledging that they've received it and, of course, verify all the information within. Pretty straightforward. Now, the other document that I mentioned, and we'll go ahead and talk about it now, is the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act. And so what happened was they outlawed the use of lead-based paint in residential properties in 1978. And then in 1992, they realized that they weren't doing good enough job explaining the risks of lead-based paint and how this all went into play. And so that's where these disclosure laws came into place in the Hazard Reduction Act of 1992. Now, please understand that this is a national piece of legislation. Every state has to abide by this lead-based paint disclosure. Of course, it works slightly different in every state because not every state uses a due diligence style contract like we do. So remember the key pieces of when this disclosure is required. It is required for all residential properties that are built prior to 1978. Not in 78. That word prior is as equally important as the year 78. So what it really means is this is only required in properties that were built in 77 and before, technically speaking. And so if you get a test question that says something about the year 1978 and it says a house built in, it's not a lead-based paint disclosure they need. Okay? It is prior to, everybody with me, 77 and before is really what it comes down to. Prior to 1978. Now, folks, there are some named exemptions. Don't read too much into them, okay? It's really weird. And so I'll explain something. For most people, lead-based paint isn't hazardous. Why? Because it's on the walls, okay? And lead, it's not dangerous to be around lead. It's dangerous to breathe in lead. It's dangerous to drink lead. It's dangerous to eat lead. Now, I don't know about you. I don't go around licking walls or chewing baseboards personally, okay? Now, I know a couple agents that I would question if they're doing it or not, okay? And some people make me wonder. But you know who is children and kids, or children and pets, kids and pets. So most people, lead's not dangerous in and of itself. And as such, there are a couple exemptions. And as I said, it's going to sound weird to you. Don't read too much into it. Exemptions for the lead-based paint disclosure: housings for elderly persons or persons with disabilities. 0-bedroom dwellings, meaning they do not have any technical bedrooms in the dwelling. Foreclosures. And then, of course, any properties that are certified lead-free and short-term leases. Don't read too much into it. Just don't. Otherwise, it's just kind of weird. It's just one of those weird legislative things where they just determined that the risk was so much lower in certain types of properties. And then I'll also clarify, too, they never actually outlawed, technically speaking, lead-based paint use in commercial properties. This was only residential properties that they outlawed it. Now, I'm not saying it's common in commercial anymore, but this is the only time that they outlawed it, was residential use. Now, I will tell you this too. The lead-based paint disclosure is hands down the single most sent back form for real estate compliance departments. And I'll tell you why. Most licensees don't realize that there is an obligation. Let me back up here. That there is an obligation for both the listing agent and the selling agent to sign it. Both licensees have to sign it. This is the only disclosure form that we are both obligated to sign. And so what happens is the seller has to disclose whether they do know or don't know about lead-based paint. And then the buyer has to acknowledge that they've received the seller's disclosure, and they have to acknowledge that they have been provided with the Lead in Your Home pamphlet that is put out by the Environmental Protection Agency. And because the sellers and the buyers wouldn't know of these obligations unless we told them, then the listing agent and the selling agent both have to sign acknowledging that they did inform them of their respective duties, obligations, and otherwise. So this gets missed a lot because people will send over these with their offers and they won't sign, the agents won't sign them. And so then we got to go back to the agent and say, hey, you didn't sign your piece. Now, very important to understand that all that's required under the law is to provide this form where the seller says, I do know or I don't know. They do not have the option of no representation. So it's either I do know or I don't know. And there is nothing requiring testing. There is nothing requiring removal. There's nothing requiring any of that. So let me show you the actual lead-based paint disclosure. Give me a second to pull this fun-filled thing up. So in North Carolina, we typically operate with a due diligence period. And this is where I'll give you some clarity on the differentiation between states. A lot of states don't operate with a due diligence style contract. They use earnest money and you know, standard kind of investigation periods without due diligence. And so what that means is there's a slight differentiation in some of the obligations. So if you look at this last note while I'm pulling up the actual agreement here, says buyer must be given 10 days to inspect and rescind the contract. This is true in every state. They have to be given a 10-day period to investigate and test if they so desire. It's not required, and they can waive their right to that 10-day period, but it is something that they have to be given if they so desire it. Now in North Carolina, because we are a due diligence style state, it says that they can conduct their investigations as part of their due diligence period. That's what it says, but this is true in every state. They get that 10 days if they want it. Now, as I said, there's no option of no representation. I should have it up here. Let me show you.
Seth, can you repeat who has to sign the paint thing, the residential paint? Is it the agent, the seller, and the buyer? All three?
All four. The listing agent, the selling agent, the seller, and the buyer.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like in it right here. I just got all these forms updated, and so they're kind of in a slightly different order. Lid. Did it move? There you go. So here is the lead-based paint addendum. So it is called a lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard addendum. Of course, we name the property, name the seller, name the buyer. And so during the due diligence period, buyer shall have the right to obtain a risk assessment or inspection of the property for the presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards at buyer's expense. Buyer may waive the right to obtain a risk assessment or inspection of the property for the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards at any time without cause. And then it also goes and gives you a disclaimer, well, hey, intact lead-based paint that is in good condition isn't necessarily a hazard. See the EPA pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, for more information. And so this kind of gives a little disclosure of, you know, certain things in the presence of it. But here's where the seller says, I do know or I don't know, and I have reports or I don't have reports. There is no option of no representation here. So presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, there is known presence or I have no knowledge. Okay, it's either I do know or I don't know. There's no option for no representation. And then records and reports available to the seller, either here's the reports I'm providing that I have, or I have no reports. Yet again, no option for no representation. So then the buyer's section, they are acknowledging the receipt of the seller's statement as outlined above. They are also acknowledging that they've received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, from their agent. And then the buyer either is going to accept or waive the opportunity to investigate during due diligence, right? Accepts the opportunity during due diligence period to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, or goes on to the second page, waives that opportunity. It's entirely up to them. So here's the agent's acknowledgement for the seller. Agent has informed the seller of the seller's obligations. But here's where people mess up. Buyer signs it. Seller signs it. Selling agent signs it, meaning whoever is assisting the buyer. Remember, it could be a seller sub-agent. It could be a buyer's agent. They need to sign it. And then the listing agent also needs to sign it. And this is why I told you this is the most sent back document in compliance department world, because one agent at least always forgets to sign it, because everybody has an obligation to sign it. Now, when we're talking about the Environmental Protection Agency pamphlet, Lead in Your Home, folks, it's very easy to find. If you just Google EPA pamphlet, lead-based paint. Okay, this is what it looks like. This is the most recent version. It was updated back in 2021, and there's a link to it right there. And as I said, I'll share this slide with you, but it's pretty straightforward. And here's one thing that I'll warn you on. Don't ever spin your opinions as facts. Because as I said, lead-based paint isn't necessarily hazardous to most people. It would be a bigger concern for people with kids, pets, and things of that nature. Creatures that eat stuff off the floor and lick walls. Okay, let's just put it that way. And then, of course, there's a bigger hazard for pregnant women, because if they get exposed to it, lead intoxication and lead poisoning can cause birth defects and all kinds of things like that. But for most people, it's not a huge consequence. But don't ever tell your clients, especially ones with kids, oh, you don't need to be worried about it. It's not a thing. You provide them the information and you let them make the decision. And I had this exact thing happen. I helped clients. It was actually the clients that I told you the story about yesterday, where, you know, they lived in the house, the rental where people were murdered, but they bought a house in Angier. Well, the house in Angier was built in like 1972. And so I gave them this pamphlet and I said, well, hey, you know, you got small children, so read this about lead. I mean, I don't know if there is or isn't in this home. The seller doesn't know, but, you know, just understand. And they were fine and they were completely okay with buying the property. But don't ever make your opinion out to be fact. Okay? Just give them the information, let them make their decisions. And as I said, the law requires both the listing agent and the buyer's agent. Okay, we both have obligations under the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act to make sure that we have complied for the buyer's side and the seller side. And we all have to sign. So let me ask you a question to make sure you're tracking with me on the lead-based paint discussions. Here's a scenario for you. A landlord slash seller of a duplex built prior to 1978 completely renovated both units about 5 years ago, including all new paint on the walls, ceilings, and woodwork. Does the agent have to obtain a lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard addendum from the seller? What should the agent disclose? And should the buyer be given a 10-day risk assessment period? Help me out here.
The renovation piece is throwing me off, because I know prior to 78, we need to do the lead-based paperwork, signature, disclosure.
Mm-hmm. And so go ahead, Caroline. You got an opinion?
Do you need to include who did the paint work, like who did the change on there? I'm not really sure. I think they should still be given the 10-day risk assessment.
There you go.
period.
Folks, yeah, understand. Yet again, just because you've painted over it, there's still probably lead-based paint behind there, or there could be. And so nothing changes here. The only thing that would change, if you could get this home certified as lead-free, then that would change things. But since it's not, because I told you certified lead-free is an exemption, painting over the walls, doing renovations, modifying things, doesn't automatically remove it. And I'll tell you another big reason why it wouldn't. Even if you ripped out all the drywall and the trim work inside, folks, it was very common that lead-based paint was used outside. Well, you know what they used to do when they needed to repaint it? They would go on the outside of the house, they would scrape it and get all of the rusty, crusty paint off, and then they would repaint it, which means there's lead in the soil around the house. And so that's another consideration. The paint would absorb into the soil, and so if your kid goes out and eats mud pies in the yard, they're still going to get lead poisoning. Just because you renovated the inside doesn't absolve it. So it was built prior to 1978. They still need that risk assessment. They still need the disclosure. Doesn't matter that it's been painted or not. Absolutely. Now here's where we get into a very fun-filled discussion. We get to talk about measuring houses. We made it. Folks, this is going to be a big discussion. Of course, this is a big part of this class. And of course, this is the segue to your homework. So as part of the pre-listing meeting, two things need to happen. We need to verify the acreage of the lot, and we need to verify the square footage. Now, as we previously discussed, we are not going out and measuring the acreage or the size of the lot. We don't have the skill set to do that. And I'll tell you, a lot of times people will use those little wheel measures to kind of get that stuff. But even that's not entirely accurate, because if you think about topography, folks, if you got a hill and you go up, then you're no longer measuring in a straight line and it's still clicking. So there's some inaccuracies to those as well. So it is okay for us as real estate professionals to rely on plat maps and surveys and, you know, the deed and the tax cards and things to verify the acreage. But when it comes to square footage, we've got an obligation to actually understand how to measure and how that's calculated and things of that nature.